Today I have with me author Jimmy Soni and his first book and most recent
second book actually.
second book. All right, that's right. I did read that you wrote another book. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
But most recent book is about Claude Shannon, and it's called A Mind at Play. And I love this book, Jimmy. I really did.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I really did. And I, like I told you before, I love biographies and autobiographies. And I have to say I was a little scared going in because just for everybody out there that if they think this book is intimidating, I was intimidated. I only have a high school education. Really. I mean, I took trig. Trig is as far up as I go. Never took a day of calculus. Okay.
Well, look, I'll tell you, we were, neither my co-author nor I are math people. The last math both of us took was in high school. And so we were intimidated in writing it. But part of the virtue of it, hopefully, is because we're not math people, the book is written to be very accessible. And if you're not a math person, you'll still enjoy it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, but I do have a weird, I was always good at math. Like I said, I didn't go to college. I ended up having children young and, did that. But I love math, and I was homeschooled my kids, so I also did a lot of math after that. But the way you explain it, I mean, even the parts that I was like, okay, whatever, you're not going to understand the math, okay? Because he was a math genius. There's no way you're going to understand the math, okay? But his story was so good. And of course, my first question is why? Why him? How did you find him?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate, first of all, thank you for taking time to not just interview me, but to do this. I know a lot of writers are really grateful for the chance to talk about their books because in a funny way, you spend all this time. I mean, we spent 5 years on this project, and you spend all this time doing it, and then it comes out. And, in an age of Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all the rest, things last for such brief periods of time. So the chance to talk about your book, you're fighting for it because you're I spent all this time on this thing.
Yes.
So I'm grateful for the chance to talk to you and to your audience. So I was reading another book that I would really recommend to people. It's called The Idea Factory by a man named John Gertner. And John's become a friend. But The Idea Factory is a narrative history of a company called Bell Labs. So Bell Labs was, in the 20th century, if you could imagine a freak merger of Facebook and Apple and Google that happens tomorrow. That is about what Bell Labs was in the 20th century. It was widely regarded as the most innovative company in the United States in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. They invented, I'll just run through a couple of them. They invented the fax machine. They invented touch-tone dialing. They invented long-distance phone calls. They invented co-invented the laser. They won 6 Nobel Prizes in the 20th century. And they played host to people like Claude Shannon, who were there as scientific researchers. And so I was reading this book, and I came across this guy's story, and I just honestly went on Amazon, and I typed in Claude Shannon, and I didn't find anything. And I thought that was so stunning because his story was so incredible, and I just would have figured that somebody had done it already. I was honestly just in the market for the book. I didn't think I would write the book.
Right.
And so I go looking, and I can't find anything. And, there are some ideas in your life that just sort of enter your life and they bother you long enough that you have to do something about it. So I contacted my agent. I said, listen, there's this thing. This guy, Claude Shannon, he's an incredible guy. He's got this sort of Richard Feynman and Albert Einstein thing going, but there's no book about him. I want to do it. I think I should write a biography of him. And so, talked to my co-author, who's been a longtime friend and collaborator, and we went and pitched Alice Mayhew at Simon & Schuster. And she's not a name that people know, but they'll know the people she works with. So she works with Walter Isaacson. Mm-hmm. She works with David Brooks. She works with Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's the kind of dean of modern biography, if there is one.
Right.
And she got it right away, partly because she had edited a book that a lot of your viewers will know called A Beautiful Mind. Which later became a movie with Russell Crowe. Right. And we were at this meeting, and I kind of said, Alice, I have this idea. I think that he's sort of it's like A Beautiful Mind in a way. I don't know if you've been any involvement with that book. And she starts laughing, and she said, Jimmy, I actually edited that book, and it won a National Book Award. And so in my moment of embarrassment, at least I kind of made her understand my model for the book. And after that, we were off to the races. But I found him because of this really wonderful book called The Idea Factory. And I'd recommend it to anybody who's interested in innovative organizations. Now, our book is obviously about one mind within that company.
Right. Well, I have to tell you, so when I started to read this, okay, I was thinking, you know what? He reminds me, because I did an interview with a guy from England, whose name escapes me at the minute. It was a while ago, a couple months ago. But he wrote a book on Alan Turing.
Was it Alan Hodges?
No.
No?
David somebody. David, I should have looked it up. I'm sorry. But anyway, he wrote a couple of them. And they were little pamphlet books because everybody, of course, saw the movie with Alan Turing. Right. And then, so I got really interested and read these little mini books and I did an interview with them. And here, it was like something that he had done in like 2 minutes. He wrote these books on Alan Turing because he'd done other things, right? So I started reading this and I was like, you know what? This guy reminds me of Alan Turing. And then as I'm reading it, it's like, oh, he kind of knew Alan Turing. That is so awesome.
It's the most, I would say, when people ask me what my favorite part of writing the book was, it was actually that chapter. Because
that's my favorite chapter to read, too.
So you imagine these two guys, Claude Shannon, who's the guy we wrote about, and Alan Turing, who is this British math genius, cryptographic genius, the subject of the movie Enigma, and of the book. These were not people who made friends easily. Claude Shannon was a bit of a loner. He kept to himself. Alan Turing was very much a loner. Right. And there was this really funny line in our research where we asked someone what it was like to know Claude Shannon, and he said, well, he was not unfriendly. So these are people who don't make friends easily, and there's this extraordinary moment in the 20th century where the British and the Americans are trying to figure out how they're going to communicate with each other securely, because the Germans have very good technology. They're intercepting phone calls, they're intercepting communications, and so they're having to ramp up the systems by which messages become encrypted. And the British don't really trust the Americans to get this right. And so they send over their very best, Alan Turing, to different sites in the United States to test the technology that's going to be used to encrypt messages. And Alan Turing comes to New York and to Bell Laboratories. And at Bell Laboratories, he meets a young scientist named named Claude Shannon. Yeah. And these two giants of the information age end up having tea every single day, roughly every day, from what we can tell, in the Bell Labs cafeteria. Now, what's interesting is it'd be cool enough that they were having tea every day, right? The modern equivalent would be, I think, like if Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were having tea every day, every one of us would want to be a fly on the wall, right? What's interesting about it is because of the rules from both of their governments, neither of them are allowed to talk about cryptography. So they're not allowed to talk about the work that they're doing. What they are able to talk about is all of their other interests. So they're able to talk about computing. They're able to ask big questions like, could you program a computer to think? And these guys, this is 1944, 1945. Computers are room-sized machines, but they are asking all these questions about things like artificial intelligence and about machine learning. All the buzz phrases that occupy our time were things that Alan Turing and Claude Shannon were talking about over tea in the 1940s. It's an incredible moment. And it's a bit, there's obviously a bit of a tragedy there, too. After the war is over, Claude Shannon and his wife fly to England, and one of the places they go is to Alan Turing's home. And this is a wonderful scene because it's almost like they pick up right where they leave off. They go to his basement, and he's building a computer to make voice sounds. And so they're playing with this computer, and he's talking about whether a computer can be programmed to talk. And sadly, roughly a year after that meeting, Alan Turing commits suicide. Some of the circumstances are obviously still in dispute, but it's one of the moments that makes you really pause and think, because these were two people who laid the groundwork for so much of the world that we live in with their theoretical writings and their mathematical writings. And they met and they were friends. And that's just kind of an incredible thing if you think about it.
Yeah. And, for the history buff in me, it's almost one of those moments that it brings them it brings me to tears, because I'm like, that is so cool. And I really could see this as a movie. I really could.
Oh,
I mean, because just like with Robert Nash. Robert Nash?
John
John
Nash.
Nash,
Yeah,
sorry.
beautiful one.
John
Yeah,
Nash, Beautiful Mind. Like, people are interested, and he comes later. John Nash comes later than
yeah.
Claude Shannon. But just the fact that he knew Alan Turing, everybody's interested in World War II right now. It's huge.
Mhm.
We're seeing movie after movie after movie on World War II, and, like Dunkirk was just out.
Yeah.
And the fact that he did have, it's like, okay, they weren't allowed to talk about cryptography,
Right.
I mean, but doesn't Turing come over why did he come over then?
So he was there to inspect the American systems for their security, right? So Bell Labs was one of the companies that was tasked with building these systems that would allow, for example, FDR to communicate with Winston Churchill and have it be protected from German interference. And what the British need to know is if the Americans are sending a signal, is it secure? And the person to test that for them, the best person they have, is Alan Turing. And that's why he's here. He's here to tour sites around Washington, D.C. and New York and visit these companies that have been subcontracted to do this work. That's why he's here in the first place. It's actually kind of funny. When we did our research, we discovered that because of the mistrust from both sides, the Americans mistrusted the British mistrusted the Americans, Alan Turing is actually held up at Ellis Island. He's like, there's a little funny business with his paperwork, and it's just kind of an interesting moment. The thing to remember, you mentioned the movie, so there is actually, I'm not breaking any confidences in sharing this, there is actually a movie about Claude Shannon's life in the works. There's a filmmaker named Mark Levinson who's the filmmaker responsible for a movie called Particle Fever.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of your viewers who have Netflix, if you go and watch Particle Fever, you'll love it. It's about the search for the God particle, the Higgs boson collider, that giant collider, and I actually can't even remember what it is, but he did that movie. It was a spectacular movie. It won a ton of awards, a ton of praise, and his next subject is none other than Claude Shannon. And so Mark's become a friend. We've been sharing our research with him, and the movie's going to be just spectacular. I believe his release partner, I won't go into those details, but suffice it to say, it's a biopic. He's going to be releasing it next year, and it'll give people who hopefully read our book another way into Claude Shannon's life. And he's interviewed a lot of the same people we've interviewed as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Of course,
Yeah.
I see it more of as like, a drama movie, but
Right.
like that's a start. Right. It's a start, but
Yeah.
People are drawn to those kind of movies. They just are. History movies about true people. I love when I'm sitting with my kids and they'll be like, I hate history. And then I'll watch a movie and they'll be like, wonder if this is true. I'm like, you understand that's history, right? If it's true, it's actually history. Okay.
Well, and people say things like, well, the book is never as good as the movie. The movie's never as good as the book. I think what's important for people to remember, and I say this as somebody who's a writer and writes books and reads them obsessively, they're different mediums, right?
Right.
I would recommend to people who saw the movie A Beautiful Mind read the book, because the book is very different.
Right.
And
it is.
There's a lot of great stuff kind of at the beginning of the book that I think got, that just by virtue of the fact that it's a visual medium and you can't do certain things, it didn't get the right treatment in the film. And I love the film and the book, but I do think that like the beginning of the book is different when you read it. And I would encourage people and anytime you have a book turned movie, make sure to enjoy both, but I wouldn't judge them against each other. I would judge them on their own merits, because they're different.
Right. Well, and even Enigma, when I started doing the reading on Alan Turing, they had a lot of things, that they had to make for the movie that were, like didn't seem like they were really portraying him as accurately as, they could have. But only when you start reading more about them do you understand that. But anyway, absolutely. Let's see. What other things? Okay, so I found
we sort of deviated. You had asked me the question how I found him. I found him through Idea Factory, and I kind of dove in a little bit further, and then went to my agent when I knew there was a story here that was worth telling.
Yeah, and that's I love when authors find these people That's what I'm saying. That's why I jump right to the biography section, because I love when you find people that you haven't, and then like I got exposed to something that I didn't even know existed, and it made my day. I loved reading every page of it. I mean, and like I said, the calculus problems. Okay, like I'll just believe that you said it worked, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, we had really good mathematicians actually read the book end to end to make sure that we didn't get any of the math wrong.
Yeah.
So we were helped in that way by a lot of people who wanted to make sure that two non-math people didn't screw it up. So we had good assistants and good research professors and others who are friends of Shannon and say, yeah, here's what you do, here's how you explain it, all that. I think that what you pointed out is something interesting, which is whenever I look for kind of the next book to read, I like undiscovered figures in history, and people who didn't get their due, or it's why I enjoy the works of Michael Lewis. I always feel like, and his isn't as historical, but I feel like he finds people that you wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. There's going to be countless biographies of presidents and of kings and of the most famous figures in history. I'm drawn to these figures who maybe don't get as much historical credit as they deserve, but they deserve a lot. And in Claude Shannon's case, I mean, this is a guy who, the reason you and I can have this conversation over Skype is because of the work he did. The reason that we can make phone calls over our iPhones, the reason satellites can send images back and forth to Earth, it goes back to work that he did in 1937 and 1948. And it's extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, this is 50 and 60 years before these technologies would ever become relevant, but somebody had to think this up, and he's the guy who did.
Yes, and I think that the beginning why I thought of Alan Turing right away is because the thing that both contributed was that they expected computers to do more than anybody ever expected computers to do. They were just so, both of them really thought like computers were going to be the way. And back then they didn't think that. People didn't think computers, but these guys were really dedicated to, feeling like computers were going to be what the future was about,
Oh, that's a really perceptive insight on your part, because that's 1,000% right. And it's not something that we necessarily state completely in the book, but you picked up on a really central piece of their lives, which is they were true believers in the power of technology to change people's lives, to change how we did everything. A great example, toward the back of the book, we talk about this Claude Shannon was sort of famous in his own era, and I think the moment of his greatest fame was when he was profiled by Vogue magazine, which is, just kind of funny to think of because he's sort of an introverted guy, and he's a little nerdy and quirky, but he has a photo shoot in Vogue magazine. He's got the suit on, and the photographer is Henri Cartier-Bresson, who's a famous photographer who did, Queen Elizabeth's coronation, Chairman Mao's funeral, and he's taking photos of this guy, Claude Shannon, in his house. But in this Vogue profile, the reason the Vogue reached out to him is because the headline of the piece is something like, Dr. Shannon wonders if the man machines can think. And the idea of computers being able to think, in this profile, he talks about he fully expects that robots are going to be walking on the moon, and one of the things we need to figure out is what happens when a robot accidentally falls into a space hole. Like, how do they get out of the space hole? He thinks about, he sort of anticipates the Roomba. He says, what happens when you have a robot housekeeper and they fall over? So he's thinking about this stuff. And remember, he's saying all this in the 1950s. Right. So this is not 10 years ago. I mean, this is decades. Computers are the size of full rooms. They operate with gears and shafts and pulleys. The digital world is a faraway prospect. And he is thinking about what happens when your housekeeper is a robot. So there is something about that, because people today can easily say, well, of course, that's obvious. I mean, technologies are just going to progress. But the truth is, I think some of these observations, some of these insights, they're only obvious after the fact, right?
Right.
It's only obvious after the fact that the Earth rotates around the sun. Right. Of course it is, but for thousands of years, people didn't believe that. And for thousands of years, or at least for hundreds of years, people presumed that machines would be mechanical devices that did certain things and had a limited range of what they could do. But Alan Turing, Claude, Shannon, these people are thinking about what the next generation, the next era of machines could do. And one of the more interesting aspects of the book is how much time Claude Shannon spends thinking about how machines can be programmed to think. Like, could you replicate a human brain? And one of the questions that obsesses him is, how do you make a machine that thinks? So he builds machines that think. He builds a mouse that can navigate a maze and remember its solution. And it becomes famous. It enters into the pages of Time magazine. He builds a chess-playing device. So he builds a computer that can play the last 6 games of a chess match. And it's called Endgame.
Right.
And you've got to remember, again, this is the late 1950s when he builds that machine. Deep Blue does not defeat a human until the early 90s. And so, you're looking at decades go by. But this is someone who fully believed that computers are going to be able to do all the things that we think they can do now.
Right. And I love the stories about Einstein and him.
Yeah.
Because it's like he so wanted to be associated with Einstein but he wasn't, right? I mean, he kind of wanted to be, right?
So yeah, I can explain a bit of it. So Einstein is older than Shannon,
right.
There's some separation in their age, and they overlap briefly at Princeton. Right. So Claude Shannon goes to the University of Michigan as an undergrad, mm-hmm. goes to MIT to do his master's and his doctoral work, and then he's given a fellowship to go to what's called the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. And if you can think of I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. If you can think of sort of like the Navy SEALs of the academic world, right. That's the Institute of Advanced Study. It's the smartest. It's a collection of some of the smartest people in the entire world who are given fellowships to spend a certain chunk of time there. And one of the people who happens to be at Princeton at that time is Albert Einstein. And so they have this period where Claude Shannon is a 24-year-old, 25-year-old grad, just finished his grad work. And Einstein is this distinguished, world-famous, world-renowned scientist. So there are a few encounters between Shannon and Einstein. My favorite story, and the one that we can, as near as best as we can tell is true, is Claude Shannon was teaching a class at Princeton, and Einstein walked into the back of the class. And Claude Shannon kind of notices him, and Einstein stands there for a second, listens, and then he whispers something to one of the students in the back of the class. And as the class concludes, Claude Shannon runs up the stairs to ask the student, what did Einstein say? And the student says, oh, he was looking for directions to the men's room. Which is pretty funny. And there's some dispute about whether it's the men's room or he was looking for where the tea was. But we like to think that, it was the men's room, which is a version of the story we heard from somebody who was in the know. Yeah. That's the one confirmed encounter that we have. Shannon saw Einstein frequently walking back and forth to campus, and he would wave at him and things. There's one story, and you'll permit me to go on a little bit about this at length because it's a disputed story. Okay. So there was a story that's made the rounds that Claude Shannon and Albert Einstein had tea. And this has been repeated a bunch, and it's this sort of famous meeting of the minds, kind of like Turing and Shannon. And honestly, upon looking at the evidence, we just could not find good basis for a tea between Albert Einstein and Claude Shannon. Claude Shannon wasn't a physicist. He was a lot younger than Einstein. And Shannon also didn't go out of his way to kind of climb the greasy pole. He didn't fight for awards and honors and meetings with famous people and all of that. He kept to himself. But more importantly, there's just no evidence from Shannon that he had ever had tea with Einstein. And Shannon wasn't shy about telling stories about the people he knew. He's the one who told the story about how Einstein walked into the back of the class. Right. He never mentioned a tea, and it seemed to not fit with the facts. And so we call it out in the text and say that we don't think this happened. It's nice to think about it, but it probably didn't happen. They did overlap for this brief period. Now, the thing to know about this is less about the meetings of Einstein and other people, and it's more this notion that just before, during, and after the war period, the public figure of the scientist is this real thing.
Right.
Because scientists are advising presidents on the war effort. They're involved in public debates. Einstein is weighing in about things like anti-Semitism around the world. So the idea of the kind of public intellectual scientist is something that is developing.
Mm-hmm.
And for a very brief period, Claude Shannon is recognized as one of these kind of big American scientists. But he runs away from the fame, and it's a part of the story that we can probably talk about a little later. But it is it's worth your readers knowing that, it's easy for us to look at celebrities now. There was an era back then of the celebrity scientist. And we have some people like that. I mean, we have Bill Nye and we have Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Right.
But I'm not sure that it's quite the same as it is now as it was then.
Well, and I always look at it like we had the people that were going off to war, okay? And we celebrate those, the soldiers that went and fought for war. But the people like him who didn't fight in the war, but they were granted to be able to stay because they had help back here because they were helping. So it's like I like to look at it like that. Like they were war heroes in their own way because the things that they were trying to accomplish, in the technology and intelligence part of the war was just as important as the men that were fighting, or just like Turing. I mean, he wasn't fighting, but he was almost living it 24 hours a day more,
It's completely right. Claude Shannon, one of the more crisis moments in his life is when he's facing the possibility of being drafted into fighting in World War II.
Right.
And he admits, I was a frail man. I didn't want to fight. I knew that the close quarters of Army life would be hard on me. And he also knows that he knows he's talented. He knows he has skills, mathematical skills that can be useful to the country. And that if he is engaged as a code breaker and as a code maker, that he can be a lot more valuable to the U.S. government than, with a rifle in his hand, trying to take the hill. And so he manages through the work of some mentors and friends to get a contract to work at Bell Labs. And his first project at Bell Labs is called Fire Control. Fire control, roughly, is when you think about a big Navy ship, a Navy ship that's going to shoot down a missile or a jet or an enemy fighter is going to have to figure out the math of that. That's a complicated statistical problem, right? It's a ballistics problem.
Yes.
And so for Shannon, what he did with that time was work on the mathematics of fire control. How do you shoot down big objects from the sky? How do you make a gun point with perfect accuracy to make that happen? That was something that needed to be figured out, and that was where he put his time and attention. There's a whole generation of scientists and mathematicians who did this work, who went in during wartime and worked at places like Los Alamos, worked at places like the Rand Corporation, worked at places like Bell Laboratories, and what they were doing was trying to figure out, how is the U.S. going to respond to the U-2 submarine boats that the Germans have? How are you going to make ships run faster? How are we going to increase production? These are all in some ways, mathematical questions. And an entire generation of people goes in and does this. And Claude Shannon's second contribution to the war effort is that he becomes engaged in cryptographic analysis and the work of code breaking and code making.
Right.
This plays more to his sort of strengths and some of his interests because he's always been interested in codes. His favorite story as a child was The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's the only Edgar Allan Poe story that has a big code in the middle.
Yeah.
But he's a code breaker, and he loves that. He doesn't say he loves that work. He does the work, and he enjoys it, and it teaches him a lot. But it's an important point to make that we praise generals, we praise presidents, and understandably, we praise soldiers for their sacrifices. There are a group of people who are a part of the war effort that often their stories don't get told, and code breakers are definitely one of them.
Right. Well, I'm calling from Allentown, where I grew up, and I was telling somebody that I was going to be interviewing you, and I was talking about, Bell Labs, and I found out there's a Bell Labs. Well, a Bell Labs in Allentown.
Right.
When I was growing up, and I didn't know it's now Lutron, or I don't know, it's called something else, but but it was Bell Labs, and I was like, wow, I didn't realize that, that there was one right there. I guess there's more than one, but the Bell Labs that he worked at was in New York, right?
two places. He works at Bell Labs when it's in the West Village in New York, and they have a big facility there. That's their home base. And then they move to New Jersey, and he follows them there. Actually, it's sort of a funny story. We found out that because he was kind of a loner and he had sort of done such important work that Bell Labs really couldn't tell him what to do anymore, when they're moving buildings, he just sticks around in the abandoned building for a while and just like works out of this abandoned building for a period before he decides to move to New Jersey, because he could do whatever he wanted. He was Claude Shannon, and so it is. So he works out of the kind of Northeast, but Bell Labs was an enormous company. I mean, this is a phone company, right? They were the phone company, so they ran everything, and they had the resources to keep people like Claude Shannon on the payroll, even when you didn't really know exactly what somebody like Claude Shannon was going to work on.
Right.
They have the means to hire these mathematical researchers who were just going to kind of be there and be very smart. And you don't win 6 Nobel Prizes by accident. Bell Labs had some method to its mayhem, right?
Right.
And it's interesting to think about too, because we interviewed somebody, an alum who was around when Shannon was around, and he said, we were taught to think in 20 and 30 and 40-year terms. Like the line that he said was, well, maybe someday this will be important to the phone company, so you should work on it. And it's like just think about it, it's like maybe someday, but they assumed they would be around, and they invested a lot in the kind of research that Shannon and his colleagues did.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you hope they're talking about at Microsoft, right? Like Bill Gates and these people are sitting around talking about, what's going to be happening. But
you'd like to think that. I think companies are obvious, for understandable reasons, are more driven by the short term now than the kind of 40 and 50 and 60-year problems. But you do see companies like Google making big investments in things that are a bit more decade, 2 decade, 3 decade long terms. You see companies like SpaceX and the companies that Elon Musk runs thinking about this stuff. In terms of scale, I think one of the companies that matches what Bell Labs felt like to people is Amazon. Amazon feels like it's kind of everywhere all at once.
Right.
That's a little bit of what Bell Labs was like. The big difference is, during the war, Bell Labs in New York goes from 3,000 employees to 9,000 employees, and there are all these military uniforms coming in and out of the office. A lot of Bell Labs employees actually go on active duty and deploy overseas. And they played a huge role in the war effort, because it was thought that when you had that much talent in one place and they were running the phone system, that they could help with the communications effort that the military had. And so there's a kind of unique moment there where they get a lot of money from the government to do research.
Yeah, and then so you find out, he dies of Alzheimer's. Okay, he suffers a long time, and it's just kind of ironic. I thought, here's a guy with he's got a brilliant mind, and then all of a sudden his mind starts leaving him, and how much he knew. I guess Alzheimer patients know at a certain point that they have Alzheimer's, and it seems like he did know, right, that he did have it, right? So it's just, I always think it's just kind of sad that it's like the thing that was him, which was his brain, then starts leaving him, and he lives a long time with Alzheimer's too.
He does. It's a really cruel part of the story, and it's sad and it's cruel. I think we write about it at some length because he is diagnosed in the early 1980s, and he does not pass away until 2001.
Yeah, which is crazy.
So he lives with it for a very long time, and it's as anybody, and I'm sure several of your listeners have had to deal with similar things, or have had to deal with a family member or loved one who has Alzheimer's. It's hard. I mean, it is just heartbreaking, because the person that you love doesn't go away in an instant. Little bits and pieces of them get chipped away over time. There's a moment that we write about in the book at the very end where his daughter, who's a little older at that time, I think in her 20s, is sitting with him in the family living room, and the family had been very interested, and he had been very interested in juggling. And they had the MIT juggling club over. They often have the MIT juggling club over their house. And the jugglers are over, and he looks at her and says, do you juggle too? And she told us, well, this was heartbreaking, because either he didn't know who I was, or had forgotten who I was, and so he didn't know that I juggled, or he had forgotten that we had spent years together juggling. and that this is something we enjoyed as a father and daughter. And it was hard. I mean, it was story after story like that. He would have memory lapses. They lived on a busy street, and so they were really afraid that he would just sort of wander into the street. It's also, again, it's a special cruelty because his mind was the thing that people so admired about him. It was the thing that gave us the world we have, that had produced all this work, and it's the thing that starts to fade. Now, the one thing I should say that's important is that from what we can gather, and this is largely from the family, Alzheimer's patients, you sort of the pieces of who they are get taken away, bit by bit. And you kind of see like people can they become kind of more of whatever they were. They can become, people can become very difficult to be around. They can get angry, bitter. Claude Shannon turned out that what happened at the end of his life was he became sweet even at the end. And his family remembers that he was funny and he was charming. He may not have known exactly who he was talking to, and he had better days and worse days. But the parts of his personality that came through were the sort of boyish, playful. The nurses at the nursing home where he finished his life would give him math puzzles. At the end of his life, he takes apart his walker to see if he can reconfigure it to make it better. And sometimes it was dangerous, but he was sweet at the end of his life, and they took it seems like some measure of comfort in that even though it was a sad and hard time, that the parts of his personality that shone through were the parts that everybody remembered, that he was a very playful guy, and that he was playful to the end. And again, it's kind of cold comfort because he does lose his life, and it would have been amazing to think about what would have happened if he had been alive in the 90s when the internet becomes a thing. And he didn't. When we talked to his wife, who actually sadly recently passed away 3 months ago, before the book came out, but we spoke to her, and Betty said that he would have been just dazzled by what the world has become if he had been able to see it and understand it. And so it's sad that he didn't get to experience it. But he did. He died in the sight of company of family and friends, and with a world of engineers and mathematicians who revere him the way that some people revere Einstein, which is an incredible legacy to leave behind.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell how much you loved him. Like, did you find as the more you were writing it, and did you really, because, when you write a biography of somebody, they become a part of you. And, did you feel like as the more you wrote, did you have more respect as, the more stories? And you said that the family at first wasn't that crazy about it, and then they opened up to you, and, I'm sure that was...
You have to be careful as a biographer to not fall in love with your subject. I mean, you really have to work at that because you want to maintain some critical distance. And there were some things that he did that, we were, critical of and all the rest. I will say that he's a hard guy not to like. I mean, he's a unicyclist and he's a juggler. He plays cards and he plays the jazz clarinet. We wrote a piece online that did pretty well on Medium, and we joked that he's like a cross between Albert Einstein and the Dos Equis guy. That he could make a viable claim to being the most interesting man in the world. I mean, this is a guy who he built one of the world's first wearable devices, and the purpose of the device was to try to game roulette in Las Vegas.
Right.
And he and his sort of partner in crime take this thing to Vegas and try to beat the odds, and they're successful. He's a hard guy not to enjoy that time with. And the truth is, when you spend 5 years writing about somebody, you try to be careful about who you choose to write about because you really do want to enjoy them. There are all these famous stories of biographers who enter dark, depressive periods because they're writing about dark people.
Right.
Claude Shannon really was a pleasant person to write about. You do have to kind of keep some distance so that you can write about them fairly and accurately. But in his case, the extraordinary part of the story, there's not the same kind of drama in his personal life, but there's a lot of drama in the discovery of things, right? One of the things that I think I walk away with from this book is he was somebody who all these thoughts that pass through our heads about stuff we're curious about, I should really get into, ice fishing, or I should really, I should really get interested in woodworking or sculpting or something. Claude Shannon was the kind of person that when that thought passed through his head, all he did was sort of switch the volume knob as high as it could go for a certain period of time. And so if I got interested in French, maybe I'll do it for a week or two and then I'll abandon it because I'll get distracted, right? Or time runs out. Claude Shannon would have gone out and like tried to write a paper about some new thing in French, right? A good example is he goes to Oxford on a fellowship, and he's in England, and he's a homebody. He doesn't like travel. He doesn't like foreign food, and it's British food. So,
right.
But the thing that bothers him most is having to drive on the wrong side of the road.
Right.
And so so this is something that bothers a lot of people. If it bothers Claude Shannon, here's what he does with it. He writes a 2,100 word paper creating a series of mirrors and things so that it's called a fourth dimensional twist. He creates a fourth dimension by which, if you're an American driver in his little design, you would feel like you're still driving on the right side of the road, right? It's a completely implausible idea.
Right.
But he writes a very long paper about it, and it's just funny. And I think what I learned from the book was what you can do when you're that curious, because that same curiosity that led him to do funny things like that also led him to build, early test plane computers. It also led him to the work, the two papers that he wrote that would form the kind of internet age for us. The power of those sorts of questions, I think, is one of the things that comes out for me, and I think it's rare. I think it's a rare quality for someone to say those things and then go and act on them.
Absolutely, because I would be like, I should study French, and 3 lessons in go, wow, French is really hard. I think,
yeah.
We're so easily, if it doesn't come easy, we're easy to abandon and be like, yeah, I don't have time. It's whatever. I won't learn French. I'll get my little translator on my phone.
It's funny. He makes a serious study of juggling, and I don't know if anybody of your viewers has tried to juggle, but juggling is not easy. No. And he ends up being able to juggle 4 balls. He's sort of embarrassed that he can't juggle 5, but it takes him years to get good at this. He studies it. He studies the math. He writes a paper about it, and he dives in a way that I find very admirable.
Yeah, because even, with genetics, he decided he was going to become interested in genetics. So he dives into genetics and then kind of solves it for himself and is like, okay, well, I did that, and then moves on. But didn't he discover, things about genetics that people were like, oh, he answered questions, but he didn't even, he didn't give it a second thought. He was like,
no.
As soon as it was like, okay, I did genetics, now move on to cryptography, because,
Yeah. He was steered into genetics. He had a really interesting graduate advisor named Vannevar Bush. And Bush is the nation's first presidential science advisor. Yes. So he advises FDR on different scientific matters, but he also, at the time, is Claude Shannon's graduate advisor. Right. And one of the things that Vannevar Bush believed was that scientists were getting too specialized. And his line is sort of, the days of Da Vinci and Ben Franklin are not over, but you need to be pushed to do different things, right? Yes. So his way of doing that was pushing minds that he identified as brilliant, like Claude Shannon, into unfamiliar fields. So one of the things that he does is he tells Claude Shannon, you need to go to New York, to Cold Spring Harbor, where there's the eugenics laboratory, and they have all this data on genetics, and I want you to study genetics for a summer. And so Claude Shannon says yes, or he really has no choice, but he sort of goes and does it. And he produces publishable work within, a short period of time. And he just decides to sort of like, that's it, I'm done. I'm good to go.
Yeah.
But it was a part of what Vannevar Bush's influence on Shannon and many others, the idea that you shouldn't just keep diving deeper and deeper and deeper into the same field, that there's some value in depth, but that there's also real value in being a generalist and in understanding different things. And so genetics was one of his hobbies. He flies airplanes. Claude Shannon flies airplanes. He studies the jazz clarinet, becomes obsessed with jazz music. His ex-girlfriend, who we talked to, said, he didn't really have very many strong opinions about politics, but he had really strong opinions about jazz music.
Right.
But you think about, it's interesting. It's like we all have our interests. But I'm not sure that I take my hobbies as far as Claude Shannon took his hobbies. And I think that's one of the lessons from his life is what happens when you take something like genetics and you spend this much time on it, and then you go and you switch and you become a cryptographic analyst. It's interesting.
I thought it was too when I was reading. I mean, I don't know how much this relates to it, but when I was reading it, I was thinking about how, imagine if Ben Franklin only did one thing.
Right.
Imagine if he was like, well, you know what? I'm going to specialize in the Franklin stove. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do anything else. Like, where would we be? The fact is that he did do all those things. And I was thinking in this age, what I see happening with our children, and I have a wide age. My oldest is 30. My youngest is 14.
Mm-hmm.
When my oldest, who's 30, was in school, he played 3 sports. Okay?
Yeah.
He did basketball, baseball, football, right? At 14, he can't do that anymore.
Right.
It's one
Right.
sport.
Yeah. One sport, and you have to
So it's like,
focus and
my 30-year-old son always says, oh my God, if I would have had to pick one sport, I don't think I could have picked one sport. I would have been bored to tears. But now, because of the way the world, so I think everybody thinks like, you got to find that one thing. You got to do one thing. But I'm kind of with them. I think, why not? Why not do more things? Why not experience more things?
And if you look at someone, let's take an example like Claude Shannon. Might seem a little bit distant to your viewers, or he's the guy from born in the early 1900s. But if you take a look at somebody like Steve Jobs, what people know, like Steve Jobs he was one of the world's great generalists. He studied design, he studied architecture. He was obsessed with the Kyoto Gardens in Japan.
Yes.
Now, what the Kyoto Gardens in Japan have to do with your iPhone, that's like, there are some lessons there about simplicity and elegance and design, but you have to have the kind of brain that says, okay, I could spend, hours and hours and hours studying more phones, or I could try to port over lessons from Frank Lloyd Wright and from the Kyoto Gardens and from, the Bauhaus movement and all these other principles. I do think that there's something to that. Here's what I would say is, I think more than ever, there's an economic imperative. People feel pushed because of their careers to specialize, because they sort of like get your piece of the pie, hold on to it. And it's harder, I think, to become a generalist in that way. I also think there's a way in which people are a little bit afraid. Like, it's scary to be an amateur, right? Like, if you start studying in French, it's uncomfortable. If you start trying to become a cook, it's uncomfortable. Anything you start new is going to be uncomfortable. One of the things that's interesting about Claude Shannon is that discomfort never really seemed to bother him. He sort of enjoyed being an amateur. And maybe that's one of the other lessons from his life is that it's okay to not everything he did was going to win a Nobel Prize. But he started a lot of new things, and it kind of kept him fresh. And I think there's fresh. Yeah, and there's something to that. I think the most interesting people I know are not people who are one-trick ponies. They're people who have like 5 different interests that all seem kind of completely incongruous, but they all fit together to make this really unique person. And I think Claude Shannon's a good example of that.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about you. Like, okay, so you wrote. Sorry that I forgot that you had written your first book, because it was about ancient Rome. As I just glanced over it and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So you went from that to this, So what is next?
Oh boy, well, a break for one thing, because writing books is not easy and promoting books is not easy. So I have a bunch of ideas I've been kind of kicking around, and there are a couple of things that I've been speaking to my editor about. And it's for me, I think I like telling stories that I don't think have been told fully, or that I think deserve more of a treatment. And I have a list. I think a lot of writers have this. They have their sort of list of projects. Everyone kind of has this, but I have this sort of list of the things I want to work on. And I'll wait. And I need to think a little bit more to see what's going to emerge and what's going to be commercially viable and all of that. I do think, one of the writers that I admire most, and I know a lot of people are fans, but I really have studied his work a lot, is Michael Lewis. And he makes this point in an interview about how it's really important for writers to not just sort of string books together like tail to trunk, and that there's value in pausing after you finish a book and giving yourself some time to see which story holds your attention. Because the truth is, when you decide to sign on the dotted line with a book, it's not like sending a tweet. Like, you're with whatever that subject is for
years.
7 to 10 years, right? It's a long time. You live with these people; they become roommates, right? And the lease is a really long lease. And so, I want to take a period now to think about what is going to be meaningful to work on. And that can be tough, because we all have people in our lives who are so productive and they have their next idea right away. I'm going to I have some things I'm working on, but I'm going to take some time now to think about what that next project is. I really like writing about the history of technology. I think that it's a totally fascinating set of topics, and I do think that there are great books, like Walter Isaacson's The Innovators is a great book. There's a book called When Wizards Stay Up Late that I really enjoyed. But the idea of these history of technology books really appeals to me, so I'll probably work on something in that space.
That's awesome. And like I said, the thing that I loved about this book, and, I don't know that going into it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to relate, okay? Because I don't have a math and science background. I love to read it, but I was like, I don't know for a fact that I'm going to read this and relate. But the way you wrote about him, it was so easy to read, and the stories were so amazing. And I kept thinking, oh my God, this is above my pay grade. This is above my pay grade. I'm not going to be. But that's what I loved about your writing. Seriously, like you took a subject that wouldn't necessarily be like how much of the public really knows about, the math and calculus and all the stuff that he was involved in. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter to his story. And you made it relatable. So I really want to thank you for doing that, because it was a very enjoyable book for me to read.
I appreciate that. I'm glad that came through. I will say it helps that we didn't know anything either.
Yeah, it does. It really does help. I'm happy to know that in a weird way, but I could not tell that. Okay,
well,
I was afraid I was getting this math genius, that I was not.
we write at the end. We write at the end about how the book could have been written kind of two ways. These sorts of books can be written two ways. One is you're an expert and you're writing the book downward, which is sort of how do you take something you know really well and make it intelligible for an audience? How do you make it basic for an audience? The other way to write it is upward, where you don't know a thing, and so you have to learn in the process of writing, and then you're actually sort of writing about how you learn it, right? And so having to become educated on this is part of the reason why I think even the complicated stuff we tried to make simple, because we had to make it simple for ourselves in order to be able to tell the story. And so we do think that, like, there were times when we were writing it that we were like, God, wouldn't it have been great if we had both had engineering degrees or if we'd been scientists? But at the same time, we'd approach it later and we'd say, it's good that we don't, because then we don't make any assumptions about what our audience knows.
Right.
And the nice thing about the book is that a lot of non-engineers like yourself or non-scientists reached out and said, hey, I don't know any. Last math I took was in high school, and this was a great read. And the other thing is his life is not all math, which is really nice.
Right. Well,
it's like all these other elements too. So
that's true, and you brought that out. But do you feel smarter?
Oh, I don't know. I think I hope not in a way, and I don't think it. I feel like a lot of writers do, where I have a lot of. I feel like an imposter all the time, and I'm just kind of waiting for somebody to kind of pull out the rug from under me and discover that this is all a big ruse. So I know that I feel smarter about Claude Shannon, and I feel smarter about certain elements of 20th century computing for sure, because you have to read a lot to do the book. But no, generically smarter, no. I do think I feel after writing it and spending as much time as we have now talking about him, I feel inspired to indulge my curiosities more. And so I feel inspired to say that if I have like a passing thought about something that I think is interesting, I'm gonna take that extra step. I'm gonna take the extra 3 steps. I'm gonna ask the questions. I'm gonna sign up for things. The one small example I can give is, I think like a lot of people, like when you're a kid, you're force-fed poetry when you're in school.
Yep.
Then a lot of people never revisit poetry,
right?
And it can become this like very daunting thing, like who sits around reading poetry,
right?
And so the sort of Claude Shannon in me said, okay, well that's kind of silly, like I should dive back in, and so I signed up for this online course on poetry, and I've been reading more of that, and it's a small thing. But I think that, when you write biographies, the subject naturally leaves an imprint on you. And if that's the imprint that Shannon left on me, I think of that as a pretty good thing.
Yeah, and that's the imprint the reading that it left on me. It really did.
Right.
I mean, so I have to say, like, I got the same thing out of it. I was like, take your curiosity, and go with it.
Just stretch it just that little extra bit.
Yeah. And I was talking to a woman earlier, an author earlier today, and what I got from her stuff and interviewing her was about how not to waste time on frivolous. It's so funny because these kind of like really relate, but
Yeah.
she was talking about like, when you sit down and you've got like, 15 minutes and you go into Facebook, right? Or Twitter or LinkedIn. And then
Yeah.
you look at the clock and it's like, oh my God, I just spent
Right.
half an hour doing, and she was talking about how we do that. They didn't have the distractions so much as we do have that distraction. And of course, they're very good at giving us distractions, but it's like taking that time and like studying French, like, doing something productive rather than sitting around and looking at pictures that your high school friends are posting other kids, or like some of it's good, some of it's not good, but you know what I'm saying is like taking your time and doing something else.
That's he was part of a generation of a great generation of just people who had indulged their hobbies. They took play seriously. I mean, he wasn't going to earn any money by riding unicycles and building unicycles and becoming interested in unicycles, but he built a whole fleet of customized unicycles. And he had this thing where he tried to build smaller and smaller and smaller unicycles until to the point that like he wanted to build something that was so tiny that nobody could ride it. And but I think there's value in that. I also think he was very good about managing his distractions. He said no to a lot of stuff. He didn't write back to every person who wrote to him. When we went to the Library of Congress and looked over his papers, there were a lot more letters that were sent to Claude Shannon than he sent out. I mean, people would write to him constantly. He just did not. He allowed his mind to focus on the things that he wanted to focus on, and didn't get distracted by the idea of like becoming famous, winning awards, responding to every person who wrote to him, making a lot of money. He pursued curiosities almost at the expense of everything else. And I think there's something to be learned from that.
I do too, and I'm taking that away from my whole day.
Great.
That's been my lesson for today. So again, I want to show the cover of this book because it's an amazing cover right there. Look at that. I love that picture of him.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All credit to the publisher. We had nothing to do with that, but there's a really wonderful designer there who made that cover.
And you know what? Covers mean a lot to us as readers. I love covers, and I love seeing, just the look on his face of that picture. That is just an amazing cover. So thank you so much, Jimmy. It was so much fun talking.
This was such a pleasure. I'm so glad we got a chance to talk about this, and I appreciate your enthusiasm about the book and your willingness to take the time to talk to authors like this.
Yeah, and I'll put all your links in the description so people can get to this book and then get to you, and and we'll get this book out there so people can read it. So
fantastic. Well, I really appreciate it, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Okay,
bye.
Bye.